Today, a weekend of resignations and recriminations descends into a war of words between Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson and their allies. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Crispin Blunt, Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, Associate Editor of the Daily Telegraph Camilla Tominey and the Political Editor of The Mirror, John Stevens. Today, the row about Boris Johnson's honours lists bursts into the open.
Boris Johnson asked me to do something that I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't think it was right.
That, as the committee Mr Johnson called a kangaroo court meets to finalise its report. What is the verdict that prompted his resignation as an MP? And what about the verdict of voters?
I think he's done the country a good turn, if I'm honest, during COVID and that. It's been a bit bullied out, if you ask me.
Mate, I think it's a good thing he resigned. I mean, it's a double standard, wasn't it, what he was doing?
Will the three by-elections produce further upset for Rishi Sunak? And what should the legal definition of sex be? Well, it has been a busy weekend in the war of words at Westminster between a Prime Minister and former Prime Minister. Let's just have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. 8 of Boris Johnson's picks for peerages blocked by Lords Commission. Yes, this is the row over the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's honours list that was submitted to the House of Lords Appointments Committee, as is usual. That is the process. But Boris Johnson has pretty well accused, and certainly his allies have accused the Prime Minister of meddling. Number 10 interfering in that list because 8 names were taken off. Boris Johnson said that wasn't what was agreed when he met the Prime Minister a week or so ago. Fury from his supporters, but the Prime Minister has come out swinging too. Let's take a listen.
Look, Boris Johnson asked me to do something that I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't think it was right. That was to either overrule the HOLAC committee or to make promises with people. Now, I wasn't prepared to do that. As I said, I didn't think it was right. And if people don't like that, then tough.
What is going on, Camilla?
Well, I think it's a case of both men self-preserving, isn't it? On one hand, you've got Boris Johnson, who I think it's no secret has got a huge amount of animosity towards the new Prime Minister because he feels that he shafted him on July the 5th, I think it was, when he resigned, and then that hammered the last nail into the premiership of Boris Johnson. And I think equally Rishi Sunak, because there was a reference to how Rishi Sunak also was involved in the COVID rule breaking, that resignation statement wasn't just a kind of one-man political broadcast and indeed a way of having a go at this kangaroo court, as he claims, of a committee, but it was also a way of having a go at Rishi Sunak. And Rishi Sunak is now having to self-preserve so that he isn't tainted by the Johnson era. And that's why he's making this great play today of, being a Prime Minister with higher standards. I mean, it's not hard to read between the lines of what he's trying to say there. We had Grant Shapps, Tobias Ellwood and others out of the weekend saying we must move on. Boris is in the past, and one might question the wisdom of the Prime Minister now making these remarks to keep the story going.
Well, what do you make of the wisdom of those remarks?
Well, I think that clearly when Rishi Sunak came in, part of his pitch was that he was going to bring calm to the warring Tory party. And actually, all we've seen is continued chaos after chaos after chaos. And there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. And the idea that Boris Johnson, just because he's stepped down as an MP, is just going to go into the shadows and we'll never hear from him again is just absolute rubbish. Of course we're going to hear from him. He doesn't need a place in the Commons to be very vocal, to say things that are flowery and interesting, that suck up all the oxygen and get lots of attention. I think that will be a problem for Rishi Sunak as you're going towards an election campaign, especially if the polls stay similar place to where they are now and you start to have Tory MPs worrying about their individual seats. Then I think it is going to be very damaging for Rishi Sunak. And the message that the Labour Party will say to voters is these people have had 13 years, they can't do anything, they can't address your problems, they're too busy fighting amongst themselves.
Do you think, Crispin, that Boris Johnson has been treated unfairly?
At various stages, yes. But the fact is, he lost the confidence of his parliamentary colleagues, so he lost the premiership. Now, I may regret the fact that collectively the Parliamentary Conservative Party frankly didn't show enough spine at the time to stand by him when the things got difficult. My own views on the seriousness of the things he was charged with is already on record. However, once you've got yourself into that place, you've then got to roll with the consequences. And there's a proper constitutional process, and it went through, and he decided he no longer had the confidence of his colleagues, and he resigned as Prime Minister. He wasn't... and he was contemplating trying to put an administration together right at the end of people who would serve in it. So what's happened is happened. We've then had this Truss Farrago, and we've now got ourselves with a Prime Minister who is thoroughly competent, who is running an administration in an astonishingly professional way by comparison with what has gone before, probably by any of his predecessors since 1997, frankly. The reshuffle was criticised by the press for not being political enough. It was actually about the administration of government, the change of the machinery of government.
So do you think Boris Johnson should just shut up and go away, as one of your colleagues has said?
Well, I think we have to accept that Boris is Boris. He is an absolutely astonishing character in politics. I feel that we are in the final chapters of the Boris story. It is a Shakespearean tragedy in many ways, equipped with that talent that he hasn't been able to use the talent.
Is it a Shakespearean tragedy?
Well, I think it's a tragedy for all those people on NHS waiting lists, or all those people who are looking at the 12th increase in mortgage rates in as many months. You know, in all of this, people and what they're going through is being avoided. And the thing that I'm interested that people haven't got cottoned onto yet is Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams.
The other two MPs who resigned.
All resigned from their being an MP because they didn't get what they wanted. Where do their voters come into it? They pledged to be there, to be the MP for their constituencies for a full parliamentary tour. Crispin is going to stand down, and he's doing it properly at the next general election. How right is it for those three to simply cast their voters aside? They didn't get elected saying, I'll stay as long as I fancy it.
Right. Well, hang on.
Sean is on to something here, because there are wider implications of what Boris is doing.
We can talk about that in just a moment, because we have Jake Berry, former minister in Boris Johnson's government, obviously a Tory MP. On the honours row, Jake, let's start with that. Rishi Sunak has said he wasn't prepared to overrule the committee that vets honours lists by former Prime Ministers, as Boris Johnson had asked him to do. Should he have done?
Well, we simply don't know to what Rishi Sunak was referring. If you listen back to that clip, and I know you've just played it on your programme, it's quite hard to work out what what the actual request was from Boris. And I think the danger is, and just picking up on something my brilliant colleague Crispin just said, I think the danger is that by sort of cracking the lid on Pandora's box of appointments to and honours, you've probably now got to a point where people are going to say, well, if something untoward is alleged to have gone on, tell us about it. And I think that isn't somewhere we should go as a party, because it's just sort of continuing an argument that we don't need to have.
Well, so what was your response to Rishi Sunak saying, if people don't like what I did, tough?
Well, my response is, Rishi, Prime Minister, I don't know what you did, so I can't work out whether I like it or not. I think the problem is that people might start saying now, well, tell us what you were asked to do.
Right. I mean, do you think Rishi Sunak is out to get Boris Johnson in the way some of Boris Johnson's allies have already said, accusing Rishi Sunak of blocking peerages, the honours list, some of the names on it?
Well, I don't know, and I think actually who gets what gongs at the end of an administration isn't what the British public care about. Right. I think when we saw Boris Johnson resign from office on Friday, it was actually not... it was a statement that he'd lost confidence in a process which is investigating him. And just look back for your viewers on that. This was triggered by a report by a senior civil servant who's now working for the Labour Party, soon to take up her appointment. And the committee itself is chaired by someone who is on record in April last year.
It's got a majority of Conservatives on the Privileges Committee.
Let me finish,
well, no,
please.
hang
But
on,
it's on
because I want to be
record.
clear.
No, it's important.
Well,
I will
yeah,
come on to that.
and I'll let
It's
you
on
finish.
record of having said in April last year, the Prime Minister having accepted a fixed penalty notice, just like the new Prime Minister did, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, has admitted that they've misled Parliament. That's a bit like getting your day in court and the judge standing up before the trial starts and saying, look, we know you're bang to rights, but there's a whole charade we've got to go through here. And I think Boris, in that committee, I think his resignation is more driven by the fact that he lost confidence in that committee to behave in a way without fear
Did you
nor
lose
favour. Now,
confidence?
I haven't seen the report, so it's impossible to say. It's going to be published tomorrow, as I understand it. We will see then, but I think there will be a moment for Parliament to question, the conclusions and the process.
Right, but you have just set out very clearly, the inference came out strongly there that you think that the Privileges Committee, in the way you described it, is biased, and it was biased against Boris Johnson.
No, that's not what I said. I simply, this is a tweet, it's in the public domain, it's something the Chair, Harriet Harman, put out there.
Did you have faith
I just
in the
say
committee?
the real world consequences of that is like arriving at court and the judge telling you bang to rights before the trial starts.
Right, so you agree with Boris Johnson?
Well, I can't tell you. Boris has seen the draft report.
Yeah.
I can't tell you whether the committee's behaved well or not. And certainly it's absolutely valid that they come up with a conclusion. But when we know those conclusions, it will be just as valid for members of Parliament across the House of Commons to talk about those conclusions and talk about the committee. That's what the British public accept, because ultimately they look at this, they see a situation where, just over 4 years ago, they elected a Prime Minister to deliver on Brexit, to be Prime Minister for, a Parliament, and via a whole series of events in which Boris absolutely has to carry his own share of the blame, that hasn't happened. I think we all have legitimate questions to pose.
Right, you may have legitimate questions, but there is also a question. Is it right for Boris Johnson or you or anybody to question the credibility of a committee of MPs that was set up to investigate Boris Johnson's behaviour and whether he knowingly lied to Parliament over Partygate? Is it legitimate to criticise and say and undermine?
I haven't questioned the legitimacy of this committee. It was set up by Parliament, like all committees
You
of
have,
Parliament.
because you've said
but
it
it's
was
completely
headed up by-
normal. Completely normal when a committee comes forward
wants it
with a
both
report
ways.
for MPs to say, I want to. There have been lots of committee reports in Parliament that I have disagreed with their conclusions, and people are free, without fear nor favour, to question those conclusions. But I'm not saying that today because I simply haven't seen. I simply haven't seen the outcome of the committee.
Siobhan McDonough, a Labour guest here, would like to ask you.
I'm just saying, Jake, you want it both ways. You're trying to cast aspersions on the committee and then saying that you don't want to suggest they've done anything wrong. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister when these procedures were agreed. There is a Conservative majority on that committee. This is the way Boris behaves. He's a coward. Rather than face that report becoming public, rather than allowing the Commons then to vote on whether they supported the outcome of the committee, and if they did, rather than facing his voters and making his argument, he ran away and started accusing everybody of bad faith. There is one person with bad faith in this argument, and that is Boris Johnson.
So, Siobhan, you're saying that I'm questioning the validity of the committee?
You
I'm not. All I am doing is putting two basic facts out there. This committee was seeded by a report prepared by Sue Gray, who we now know is going to be Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff and has been negotiating, allegedly, according to the papers, with the Labour Party for months.
So you think that report doesn't stand credibility?
This committee is chaired by a Labour chairman who, before she was appointed to the committee, as an extraordinary parliamentarian, Harriet Harman, tweeted in a public forum that the acceptance of the fixed penalty liability was an admission of guilt.
But
and all I'm saying for the British
Jake,
public watching this, that
Sir
doesn't feel
Bernard
like
Jenkins,
a quasi-judicial
Sir
role.
Bernard Jenkins, a Conservative MP who discovered Brexit years before Boris Johnson decided it was going to get him into number 10, and to Charles Walker and all his other colleagues were on that committee and had an equal part in coming to decisions, whatever that decision is. And you are treating them with bad faith by making accusations, by suggesting it's not quite right.
Sorry,
and
it's just
you have to come down.
You're not
Are
listening to
they
what I'm
right
saying.
or are they wrong? You can't carry on having it both ways.
Right, and before...
Well, no, sorry.
Well,
that
answer
is just
briefly, let me bring in the
complete
others.
And utter nonsense.
All right,
You're
well,
not actually listening to what I am saying.
All right, I'm going to come
I'm
back
to
saying
you.
there is a
Listening very
process. It
clearly.
will become before the House of Commons, and we will all have our opportunity
Yes.
to have a say in it. I'm not in any way talking about the conclusions because I simply don't know what they are.
Right,
and
well,
the idea that in way I'm trying to talk about it is just complete
All right,
and
well,
utter
I think
balderdash.
it's time that we actually told our viewers what we now presume to be the outcome of the Privileges Committee report, because they're meeting actually shortly, around now, ahead of publicising it. And this is what triggered Boris Johnson's resignation on Friday, which must have meant that they'd found he had knowingly misled Parliament over Partygate and would issue a sanction that would have led to a recall petition and a by-election. Just before we show his response, the response that he actually submitted, already allies of Boris Johnson have said that he shouldn't be blocked from standing in another seat. Do you agree with that, or do you think he should be blocked, as Tobias Ellwood said, a Tory MP, from standing again for Parliament?
I think that's a decision I would be rather delighted not to have the responsibility for.
Well, what do you think?
My instinct is that it would be wrong for Boris to try and stand for Parliament for the next election.
Right, and what do you think, Jake?
Well, again, I was for a very brief moment party chairman, and I would have made those sorts of decisions. I'm going to agree once again with my brilliant colleague Crispin and say I'm dodging the bullet on this one.
No. He said it would be wrong for him to stand, and you're usually very quick to come forward. So state, which way should it be?
Well, I'm glad it's a decision I don't have to make.
Right.
But actually, I don't think any former Conservative MP should be blocked for applying for an open selection at any election to become a Conservative MP.
Right, even if they're found to have knowingly lied to Parliament by a Privileges Committee of MP and sanctioned more than 10 days, which would have led to a recall.
I think Boris will find it tougher than he thinks to actually get selected.
Right. Let me just give you his response to the report by the Privileges Committee, even though we haven't seen it in public. Boris Johnson said, "I take my responsibilities seriously. I did not lie, and I believe that in their hearts the committee know it. But they have willfully chosen to ignore the truth because from the outset their purpose has not been to discover the truth or genuinely to understand what was in my mind when I spoke in the Commons." He goes on to say, "Their purpose from the beginning has been to find me guilty, regardless of the facts. This is the very definition of a kangaroo court."
If that was signed Donald Trump, you wouldn't be surprised, would you?
Right.
They are both carrying on in exactly the same way, throwing around blame, making accusations and forgetting about the voters.
I take your point, Siobhan, but when it comes to the Harriet Harman tweet, it could have been suggested to her that because she had tweeted on this specific point, I think if you'd made a general point in a tweet about not liking Boris Johnson or thinking he was X, Y and Z, that would be one thing. But because she tweeted specifically about this and gave her judgment, would it not have been wiser to have avoided a conversation about whether the committee is indeed chasing after a foregone conclusion for her to have recused herself? Because
Harriet Harman has been an MP for over 30 years.
But it's just that tweet.
She's been
it's
a
just
senior
that specific
member
tweet, Siobhan.
in a Labour government. She has done great things. I have every confidence
Nobody's
that a
doubting
woman
her
of
as a
her
parliamentarian.
stature is entirely able to stand back and look at the facts. And I am absolutely as confident, this is not a party political point, of everybody who gave their time and their effort in really difficult
But she had
circumstances
prejudged those
to
facts.
be on that committee.
Jake, was it right for Boris Johnson to describe the Privileges Committee as a kangaroo court? Right or wrong?
Well, look, Boris has seen the report. He has drawn his conclusion on that. I haven't. I'm going to reserve, judgment on that. I'll happily come back tomorrow once I've seen it.
Fine, but should he have used those words? He's used those words. Should he have described it, such a loaded term, as a kangaroo court?
Well, as I say, he's made those comments in light of having seen the report. I haven't seen the report, so I won't either comment on the appropriateness of it or make my own views clear.
Well,
I'll happily come back on tomorrow and talk to you when I've seen the report.
Extra security has been scrambled to protect MPs on the committee following Boris Johnson's words, calling it a kangaroo court. Should MPs who echoed those remarks also be sanctioned if that's what the Privileges Committee decides to do?
Well, that again is a matter for Parliament, and I don't intend to prejudge what my colleagues may do. But I would just make the point that it is, we have to ensure that when, legally incorporated committees of the House of Commons come together like this, that MPs with respect and with sort of courtesy in mind are absolutely free to comment on both the content and the conclusions of a report.
All right,
and I'm a bit old-fashioned, by the way. I think you should comment on the content and conclusions when you've seen it, which to me as a lawyer seems quite sensible. It's why I'm holding back.
Well, except I was asking you about the term that's already been used by Boris Johnson.
Well, as I said,
content.
Boris has had the opportunity to see the report. I have not.
Right. So actually, you obviously think if it was fair enough to use that term, despite the implications that it's had.
That's not what I said.
Right,
but he has seen the report. I have had not.
All right.
I simply won't make a comment on whether it's appropriate or not because I can't tell you.
There are 3 by-elections coming up as a result: Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams. You've written today in the newspaper saying that he was a huge electoral asset. Do you think the Tories can win any of those by-elections?
Absolutely. I've written today in the Express to talk about how a new vision of bold conservatism, one where we tackle the status quo, we take on things like the legacy of the illegal war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic in a new, bold way to change people's lives. I think if we go down that road, and I know led by Rishi Sunak, we can absolutely hold all of those by-elections.
All
and
right.
I look forward to campaigning with my colleagues out on the doorstep selling that positive message for Rishi.
Jake Berry, thank you very much. Let me just show you the 3 departing MPs here. They've triggered the by-elections: Boris Johnson in Uxbridge and Ruislip, Mid-Bedfordshire, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams, Selby and Ainsty. You can see the majorities there. The most marginal one is Boris Johnson, obviously Labour particularly, and the Liberal Democrats setting their sights on those 3 by-elections. Can the Tories hold on to them?
I think it's been really tricky for them to hold on to them, but I think that Rishi Sunak would be relieved that the other name that was on that list and was taken off, Alok Sharma, who's in Reading West, isn't there, because that would be another seat that Labour would be aiming to get. That's exactly the sort of seat that Labour would need to win if they're on course for a majority at a general election. But those seats aren't going to be great for Rishi Sunak. And this whole row about the Privileges Committee and this investigation isn't going away just because Boris Johnson's gone. That report is still going to be published. MPs are still going to have their say on whether they accept it or not.
Right. How big an impact on Rishi Sunak's government?
Well, the report itself or these by-elections?
The by-elections.
Well, I'm just looking at the majorities now. So I'd say, Boris's is obviously Labour Party will be going after it. There were some reports at the weekend that with regard to the other 2, Dorries and Adams, it depends on whether Labour are going to do any kind of deal with the Lib Dems with regard to trying to keep Tories out of those 2 seats. If he loses 3 by-elections on one day because we've got this talk of CCHQ expediting the whole process, then it's not going to be a great day for him. But I don't think the Tory party's got the appetite for another change of leadership.
No, you say that with hope, or
I say that with hope. I say that with a journalistic hope for copy, yet perhaps some respect for the country. That's the last thing people need.
Exactly. A colleague said to me, "What an extraordinary week it's been." And I reflect back, well, I think it's been about average for the last 312 weeks since we had the referendum. And we've been through this most extraordinary era in politics where the 2017 general election in particular played the country a joker by giving it a parliament that was against Brexit, having voted for Brexit.
Well, let's not relive all the history, but I take your point that it's been pretty...
And it's therefore...
high drama for a very long time.
And pasted onto that has been the epic of Boris.
And you think he should shut up and go away,
which I think
really?
is coming to an end. I'm very sorry about Nigel and Nadine deciding to pack it in now. All 3 of them I would like to regard as mates. And it's just a rotten way to end your parliamentary career.
All right.
And the point I was trying to make before, where I was aligning with Siobhan a bit, is about the duty UN. Siobhan was talking about duty to constituents. In Boris's case, there is part of his legacy, which is Ukraine. And he was the first Western leader to be absolutely clear about getting support to Ukraine. British support to Ukraine in the early days.
Another Prime Minister here might have done the same.
Was absolutely critical. They might have done. But Boris did support the Defence Secretary in taking weapons out of the British Army Reserve for Kiev at the time last year. And our support has continued with missiles and tanks leading the way. And
you're making a defence of Boris.
Boris ought to be protecting that part of his legacy, if, as I believe it is part of his
Right, well, let's
legacy.
talk about the by-elections. A deal with the Liberal Democrats to make sure the Tories don't win. Is that something Labour should be thinking about?
I've got no idea. I do know that it's hard to win a by-election. I do know that the voters will resist, you know, some of the nonsense that's flowing around. And for most people, they'll be voting about how do they feel financially, what do they think's happening to the NHS.
Would you be open to the idea of some sort of deal being done? Because they are quite big majorities there in Mid Bedfordshire.
I'm against doing a deal with anybody. I think anybody who wants to stand should stand, make their case and fight their corner. And I think Labour should do it in all 3 seats. I don't underestimate the difficulty of any of the seats, including Uxbridge, because you might recall that back in '97, after we had our brilliant Labour election result under Tony Blair, we had a by-election a few months later, and we didn't manage to gain Uxbridge. Now, there's been lots of change in who lives there, so I don't think Labour should underestimate the fight in Uxbridge. We need to argue our case and run as good a campaign as we possibly can in all 3 seats.
Parties never want to admit, of course, or even encourage the idea of a deal, but will they, do you think?
They're not going to do a deal. They don't need to do a deal. They're just going to use common sense that Labour will look at those 3 seats and concentrate its resources on the seats that it's most likely going to win. And so clearly that is Uxbridge and South Ruislip. And then if you had to pick out the other 2, because it's less clear if you don't want to vote Tory, if you're going to vote Lib Dem or Labour in Nadine Dorris's old seat, then they're probably going to put more resources into Selby and Ainsty instead.
Right. There was an interesting piece, very briefly, in the Mail on Sunday, where I think they went to some constituents in Nadine Dorris's seat to ask them if they would like Boris Johnson to be the next candidate there, and they made some fairly positive noises. Now, even if he wasn't the candidate, it would indicate perhaps that if... I mean, it depends what characters are selected to challenge Labour in any of these seats, right? I mean, that's the other.
if Boris Johnson wants to do it, the deadline to apply for those 2 seats is this evening, so he's not got much time.
Wouldn't he wait and hope that they get lost to Labour so that he can then ride back in like a knight on a white charger?
Well, that's the next chapter, as you were talking about, Crispin, in the very long political saga that has really started in 2016, or if not before. Let's talk about Scotland and what's happening with the SNP, because, of course, the other very dramatic event that happened yesterday was the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon being arrested. This is all tied up in an investigation into the funding and finances of the SNP. She's the 3rd person to be arrested and then released. There are calls, though, now for her to be suspended from the party following that. Interviewed by the police for about 7 hours. Let's get the latest with BBC Scotland correspondent James Shaw. James, what's Nicola Sturgeon said?
Well, she hasn't actually spoken, and we don't imagine that will happen until she returns to Parliament. She suggested that might be within the next couple of days. But she has released a statement, and in that she says that the events of yesterday were shocking and deeply distressing. She goes on addressing her supporters. I would never do anything to harm either the SNP or the country. And perhaps the strongest part of this statement goes like this. I know beyond doubt that I am, in fact, innocent of any wrongdoing. Now, the words beyond doubt and innocent of any wrongdoing, it's hard to imagine a statement that could be more trenchant or definitive than that.
I mean, James, we'd also just seen the interview yesterday with Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, her successor, saying she was in great shape and things were going well. Who has called for her to be suspended?
Well, it's interesting. There are voices you would expect from outside the Scottish National Party saying that she should resign or that she should be suspended by Humza Yousaf. But those voices are also coming from within the SNP as well. So Michelle Thompson, who's an MSP who was in difficulties a few years ago and was forced to resign, she later came back to the party. She's put out a statement saying, you know, what applied to me should also apply to her. She says that, you know, she should be judged on the values that she forced other people to adopt. Her values should be consistent. And then one of the contenders for the leadership of the SNP earlier this year, Ash Regan, has said that Nicola Sturgeon should resign, and if she won't, then Humza Yousaf should consider suspending her. So a very difficult time for Nicola Sturgeon, considering her own future, but also for Humza Yousaf as well, as this situation really engulfs and buries to some extent the whole agenda that he might be wanting to put forward in different circumstances.
James Shaw, thank you very much. Now, MPs are going to be debating the legal definition of sex this afternoon. It's because 2 petitions from either side of the debate received more than 100,000 signatures. And because of that, there will be this debate in Westminster Hall later today. Now, here's one of the petitions. It says, update the Equality Act to make clear the characteristic sex is biological sex. And you can see here it's got 109, 463 to be precise, signatures. This petition asked the government to change the Equality Act to make it clear that in UK law, sex means biological sex and not sex as modified by a gender recognition certificate. Now, then there is the other petition. It has a different view. Commit, it says, to not amending the Equality Act's definition of sex, and it has nearly 139,000 signatures. This petition said that the change to the Equality Act proposed in the first petition would remove legal protections for trans people, an already marginalised group. Let's welcome our 2 guests to discuss this. Maya Forstater, who set up that first petition you heard. She's the director of Sex Matters, which campaigns on these issues, and by Robin Moira White, a barrister and author who's written a book about transgender law. Welcome to both of you. Maya, why did you set up this petition calling for the legal definition of sex to be changed?
To make the Equality Act clear so that it protects everyone's rights. There are already protections in the Equality Act for transgender people. It's called gender reassignment, and there are protections against sex discrimination for both men and women, which come originally from the Sex Discrimination Act. And when the Equality Act added gender reassignment, it didn't mean to destroy women's rights. Those 2 characteristics, just like others, age, disability and so on, are different characteristics. And so what we're asking the government to do is just to make clear that sex in the Equality Act means sex, and that if you have a gender recognition certificate, which is a certificate that lets people, for example, get married in a different legal sex or to collect a pension, that doesn't change their sex for the purposes of sex discrimination protection.
Robin, why did you sign the second petition, which said the law shouldn't be changed?
Well, sex under the Equality Act is more complex than biological sex. And if we accommodate trans people in our society, if someone becomes a trans man, they transition from female to male, then they want to live their life as male. And the law needs to treat them in their acquired gender for them effectively to live in society. And the proposed change would effectively banish trans people from their normal place in society.
Right. Well, Maya, what do you say to that, if that's the practical consequence, as Robin sees it, of the change that you are proposing?
That's nonsense. The Equality Act doesn't tell men and women how to live. If somebody wants to change their name, change their pronouns, change their style of dress, their hairstyle, call themselves what they like. Some people take hormones, some very, very few people have surgery, but that is a very small minority. Most trans people don't. There's nothing in the Equality Act that says that to be a man you have to be manly and to be a woman you have to be womanly. It just says that employers and service providers shouldn't treat people unfairly because they're a man or a woman. And then it says there are very specific situations where you are allowed to have basically a policy or a sign on the door that says female only. And those are situations such as where women are getting undressed, where they're vulnerable, where they're sleeping. So dormitories, changing rooms, showers, communal showers, communal changing rooms in the gym, mental health wards, hospital wards, women's refuges. And all of those places are places where women should be able to expect that where it says female only, it means female only. And that doesn't mean that service providers shouldn't also accommodate trans people, but they can't accommodate trans people while giving women assurance that a space is going to be single sex and mean single sex.
Robin, what do you say in response?
It doesn't work. I mean, I'm somatically female. I transitioned 10, 12 years ago. But the effect on non-trans people would be devastating. So the idea would be that trans men who can look very male would be expected to use female facilities, female changing rooms. And so you would be forcing trans people into the inappropriate facilities, which would cause great difficulty for non-trans people, let alone the trans people who are being made to use facilities which are just not appropriate for them.
Maya?
Not at all. The Equality Act doesn't force anyone to use any particular facilities. It just makes it lawful for service providers to exclude them. And the obvious thing to do, and most large places, large venues, pubs, airports, universities and so on, already think about transgender people and non-binary people, and they have unisex options. So this is not about forcing somebody into a place that they don't want to be. It's about being clear about the places they're allowed to be and where they're not. And Robin says that Robin is somatically female. To me, I see Robin as a man. Many people see Robin as a man and be just as uncomfortable undressing in a space with Robin as any other man. And that's not to say that Robin's feelings of identity are not real. They just don't have a place in a space where women and girls are getting undressed.
Robin?
If we're going to accommodate trans people in society, then we have to accept that what the trans refers to is transition to an altered state, and not sending them off to some third space ghetto, which is not part of transitioning in society and being accepted as we are. The current Equality Act includes a number of exceptions where there are particular needs for additional privacy. There's a definition in terms of achieving a proportionate means of achieving legitimate aim where trans people can be excluded. We will no doubt have all seen the debate in sport where it is possible in elite competitive sport for it to be lawful to exclude trans men from female events. And the current legislation has those nuances and allows those nuances. What's being proposed is a complete sledgehammer that would force people into inappropriate spaces.
I mean, Maya, is this about single-sex spaces? Is this what this boils down to? Explain to our viewers why, again, the law as it is currently drafted in the way Robin has explained doesn't account and doesn't protect women in the way you want to see it. I mean, the clarification seems to lead to blocking out and preventing trans people in many instances, rather than just clarifying the protection that already exists for biological women.
This is a very limited change. So Robin says it's a sledgehammer. It's not at all. It won't affect Robin at all because Robin does not have a gender recognition certificate. Only around 5,000 people in the country have a gender recognition certificate. So most people who are trans are legally the sex that they were registered at birth because they haven't gone through the process of applying for a gender recognition certificate. Only 5,000 people have. And this is simply saying that those 5,000 people, for the purposes of the Equality Act, remain their biological sex and are protected against sex discrimination in their biological sex as trans men. So female people who identify as men may still get pregnant. They need to be protected against sex discrimination. And so it says that there won't be two tiers of protection for trans people. All trans people are protected by the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but it doesn't change their sex. And so organisations where they set clear policies that are based on sex, they can be confident that that's lawful and that they're not going to be sued.
Yeah,
and
I mean, that's an important point, isn't it, Robin? I mean, it is also about protecting what organisations decide to do. I mean, what do you fear so much by the proposed change, Robin? Is it that you don't actually trust perhaps the motivation, not of Maya particularly, but of the changes that may be made by the government, that you are so clear that it will be disastrous for trans people?
I have no doubt about the genuineness of Maya's beliefs and Maya's motivations. I'm a practical lawyer. It's the practical effect. I was in the Palace of Westminster last week and asked to use the lavatory on my way to a committee room and was shown to the female lavatories. I mean, since I transitioned 13 years ago, those are the facilities I've used. I've been accepted to use, causes no difficulty that I'm using. And if this proposed change was made, then I would be forced to use male lavatories. How
there
can
are
that be
unisex
possible?
lavatories in Parliament.
I have no desire to be ghettoised into unisex facilities.
Muslim women
transition.
cannot use the toilet that is shared with men. Your desires are not the only desires that need to be accommodated in public life.
Well,
Robin?
I'm sorry to say, that's not the response that I get from the many women I work with, that I use services with. Early in my transition, I joined the gym club, and the person who was running the club asked the group of women, explain my circumstances. I asked her to. My circumstances were explained to the other people using the club, about 20 women, and she assured me that not a single woman objected to my using those facilities. So I appreciate there is a small number of people who have a difficulty, and we need to work out how to accommodate them.
All right, Robin and Maya, just hold on for a second, because I'm going to ask the legislators here. Should the law be changed? You've heard both opinions across the divide, representing those two petitions. And Kemi Badenoch, the Women and Equalities Secretary, has written to the Equalities Watchdog asking for advice on how sex should be defined in law. Should it be changed?
Well, if we're going to fiddle about with the Equalities Act and cause a practical problem for most of the trans population, and quite a serious practical problem about actually getting out, because if you can't use facilities or are not willing to use facilities that you don't feel comfortable in and don't look as though you ought to be in, well, that carries serious implications for how people are going to carry on their lives. And we need to remember that there are quite a lot of trans people. They're just hidden. They don't. People have perhaps different identities at work and in their private life. So we just need to be very careful about making changes about the implications. That's why I tend to agree with Robin on this.
On Siobhan, what do you think? Should the law...
Well, because the Equality Act sits alongside the Gender Recognition Act, and we ducked making changes to gender recognition. Having gone through an enormous consultation process, a massive amount
Well, that was the Conservatives.
And the point being that when Maya says there are only 5,000 gender recognition certificates, that is an example of the failure of the process, because it's so difficult to get a gender recognition certificate, and so most people don't go down.
Well, Siobhan, what's your view? Because the Labour Party has also struggled with this issue in terms of clarity. Listening to what Maya has said, do you agree with her that there needs to be this extra protection, or this clarity, as she calls it, in terms of the Equalities Act?
My understanding, there is a need for clarity because of a High Court decision in Scotland, which looked at whether or not gender reassignment trumped sex at birth. I agree with Maya. I think the Act should be changed. I think my understanding of it is there's 3 provisions in the 8 characteristics protected in the Act, which again the Act was a great triumph for Harriet Harman, who we were speaking about earlier, and they include sex, gender reassignment and sexual orientation. And there are a small number of services, prisons, as we've seen from Scotland, NHS services, social care services, where women who say they want to be treated by women or who need that security, it's women who are in the main victims of violence, that these protections should really exist.
All right, very briefly, Robin and Maya, just a final thought responding to the MPs. Robin first.
There really isn't any evidence that there's a problem in the NHS. A trans organisation made a Freedom of Information Act request of all the NHS trusts across the country, and there wasn't a problem.
All right, and Maya, finally a thought, responding to what Crispin had said?
We hear every day from women who are self-excluding from services and who are being bullied and harassed because they say they simply want to be treated by women or to have a single-sex service. The Equality Act is meant to protect everyone in the country, and this clarity would allow it to do that.
All right, Maya Forstater and Robin Morah-White, thank you both very much for joining us, and thank you, of course, to all of my guests today. A big week ahead at Westminster. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. From all of us, though, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.